So you can't design a fiscal system that's going broke at the rate of an additional $1.4 trillion per year, hoping that 433 people can be taxed to the max, or even millionaires. How many people are making $1 million per year? The answer to that is about 236,000 people, or about the combined population of Rhapsody and Sioux Falls. So out of a population of 310 million people, you got a little less than 250,000 people who are making $1 million a year. But by the way, that fluctuates from year to year. A lot of it's based upon capital gains, not upon income. As a matter of fact, the share of income by the upper 1% of this country, and I'm not defending them, by the way. I used to be in that 1%, maybe I will be again. But the share of the income has fallen from 17% in 2007 to 12% today. So they have been battered by this implosion of wealth from real estate and the stock market and so forth. As a matter of fact, the average American today is about 4% poorer than they were 6 months ago. Our total household net worth has fallen to about $54.7 trillion total. And in 2007, it was over $70 trillion. All of us have generally suffered. The average house in America has depreciated by about 20% in the last 5 years. And we know a lot of areas like Las Vegas and Phoenix, bubble cities, where it has fallen even more than that. So there aren't as many millionaires and billionaires to soak as the administration hopes. Finally, before we go to Q&A, one of the things that made me very angry was when the incumbent sent back the statue of Winston Churchill to Great Britain. Our mother country. Yeah, we had a few quarrels when they burned down the White House in 1812, minor things like that. But for 2 centuries, Great Britain, whose language we've taken, whose laws we've taken, whose history and so forth we've taken. This statue of one of the great men of the 20th century was sent back. We don't want it here in the White House. Why? He was a great conservative, too. Not just a man who stood against Hitler and the Axis almost by himself in the dark days of 1940 before we entered the war. But also a man who could say, in capitalism, there's an unequal distribution of wealth. In communism, there's an equal distribution of misery. And if we compress wealth in this country from the top down and the bottom up and so forth, so that we are all mediocre, and we all make the same thing, of course with the exception of certain elites and bureaucrats, just like in the old Soviet Union, who run around in the big limousines while a lot of people almost starve. The unequal distribution of wealth is better than the equal distribution of misery. July 10th, 1985, I decided to take my young family to the Soviet Union. As my younger son said, another one of Dad's weird vacations. We go to places like Vietnam and Borneo and all the rest of these places. And I had to chase Manhattan in Hong Kong, and then we traveled a lot. And it was the evil empire that Reagan had described, but that year it had a brand new president, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev had been the head of the secret police, the KGB. He knew how rotten the whole system was, how absolutely fictional all the economic statistics were. People all the way up from the shop worker who inflated how much he produced to the manager of that department, the man who ran the factory, all the way up. It was a total house of cards, and Gorbachev knew it. And therefore he instituted reforms, both democratic and economic, that took the Soviet Union to become, again, Russia, a much better place. As a matter of fact, the Russians are out having the the Russian winter today, protesting all the corruption and all the bad ballots and so on. So this past spring, we had the Arab Spring with all these Arab countries revolting against despots and autocrats. We're now having the Russian winter. And in the fall of 2012, we're going to have the American autumn against our own bureaucrats. Another great Brit was Margaret Thatcher.
Yes.
And she's been slightly misquoted, but I'll use it instead of the whole quote, paraphrased, is the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money.
That's true.
And that's exactly what's happening in Europe. And I'll put about 2 minutes and we'll talk about Europe and any other question you've got. Tons of questions you have. But it's true. All these socialist countries are running out of money because they've overspent. They cannot possibly keep the promises they have made. In the United States of America, we don't have yet retirement ages as low as 60. We don't have as generous a pension funds for public sector workers at early ages as they do. Socialism eventually runs out of other people's money. Here's the bad news. Now they want our money. The IMF, to which we have $85 billion in capital out of the loanable funds of $380 billion, is now being sort of, hey boys, you want to loan us some money? Italy alone has debt next year to roll over $500 billion. And it's Spain, around 240 billion euros, so that's a little over $300 billion US. You keep adding it up. There's not enough money in the world. But there's always the good old United States of America. To its credit, the current administration knows that after having bailed out as many institutions here as were done in late 2008, and by the way, some of those bailouts were necessary, some weren't. But the administration knows that it's political suicide if the IMF loans the money, because part of that's American money. That's our money. And believe me, there are some great United States senators on the conservative side. I'm sure John Thune is one, and there are other people out there, Oklahoma senators, et cetera, et cetera. And South Carolina. I mean, there's no way we're going to spend American money to support bloated Greek pensions. They got themselves in this mess with a debt of 163% of GDP. And that's where we're headed by the time this young lady who asked me the question yesterday is 30 years of age. And then finally, another Brit that I appreciate is George Orwell. And George Orwell, of course, wrote 1984. It is an incredible book he wrote in the 1940s about Big Brother and how Big Brother knew everything. Big Brother was omnipresent. You couldn't even turn off Big Brother on the television set in your room while you slept, and so forth. He also wrote another book that some of you may have read, and if you haven't, read it. It's called Animal Farm. And it's all about, it's a parody on communism, how all the animals are equal. And then toward the end of the book, some animals are more equal than others, right? And that's another problem with socialism and communism. And I saw that in 1985 in the old Soviet Union as Gorbachev was taking over. Everybody who rode around in the big black stretched limousines, those were government officials. Those were private individuals. But here is one of the best lines from Orwell I've ever heard. He said, "Some ideas are so stupid that only intellectuals believe them." And we got a lot of stupid intellectuals with stupid ideas here. Finally, in conclusion, one other young lady in this class yesterday asked me, because I think she was very impressed with the points I'd made about how we can revive this economy through a lot of things, but that the debt was eating us alive. She said, "Why don't the politicians listen to the economists?" And I said, truthfully, I said, well, they do, but some economists feel one way and some economists feel the other. Remember the old Ronald Reagan quote that they had to have two hands because on the one hand this, on the other hand that. I listened mostly to people who are disciples of the Austrian school, people like Friedrich von Hayek and his disciples. And of course, one was Friedman. And Friedman, of course, had been a disciple at one time of John Maynard Keynes, who is also being taken out of context, by the way. I won't defend Keynes, except to this extent. Keynes believed that you should build up surpluses in good times, right? And then you should run deficits in bad times. Keynesian economics is recessionary economics, right? So you've got a big balance, and all of us as individuals have balance sheets, so do most of the governments, assets and liabilities, and when times are good, you build up surpluses. And then when times get bad, you spend those surpluses and you even issue debt and go into debt to get out of recession. But our problem is, with the exception of 3 years, in the very late 1990s and early 2000s, I think it was fiscal 98, 99 to 2000, for which Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich are taking undue credit. But we've not run surpluses since the 1960s. And by the way, the reason we ran them those 3 years were, number one, we had Social Security surpluses of over $100 billion per year, and that was in the general treasury. There is no Social Security trust fund, except in the mind of an accountant sitting in Washington. And John Thune brought to David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, Chief Accountant, to Rapid earlier this year. And he's written some very doomsday things about curing things. $100 billion there. Then also we had a booming stock market. We had capital gains taxes because people had gains of $100 billion a year. There's $200 billion right there. Now we've got deficits on Social Security, $111 billion this year, just from the reduction of the payroll tax, which is actually called FICA, which is actually a Social Security tax, right? And of course, we don't have many capital gains to talk about. On top of that, we've got a spending machine of people who use our money and our children's money and our grandchildren's money to get reelected now. So, that is it, and I'd love to have a few questions if we have time.